The wind howled across the frozen hills, sweeping white snow over the small wooden cabin that stood alone at the edge of the forest. Inside, Clara Hayes sat near the fireplace, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The clock on the wall ticked slowly, marking another lonely hour in the long Montana winter. The fire crackled, but even its warmth could not fill the emptiness of the house. It had been 2 years since her husband Samuel died in a logging accident. The silence that followed his death was heavier than the snow on her roof. Each morning, Clara woke before dawn to feed the animals and break the ice from the water troughs. Her days were filled with work that never seemed to end. Hauling wood, mending fences, cleaning, cooking. Yet it was the nights that hurt the most. The nights were cold and long, with only the sound of the wind and the memory of her husband's voice to keep her company. She often sat by the fire and spoke softly to the empty chair across from her, pretending he was still there. On one such night, when the snow was falling thick and heavy, a faint sound reached her ears, a dull thump outside the cabin. At first she thought it might be a branch falling under the weight of snow, but then she heard it again. A muffled groan followed. Clara froze. Her heart beat fast as she stood and reached for the oil lamp on the table. The storm outside was fierce, and no traveler would be foolish enough to be out in such weather. Still, the sound came again, closer this time, like someone struggling to move. She hesitated at the door, her fingers trembling as she lifted the latch. The cold wind rushed in, biting her face. She lifted the lamp high, the light flickering through the swirling snow. At first she saw nothing but white. Then, just near the barn, she saw a dark shape lying in the snow. Her breath caught in her throat. It was a man, face down, half buried in the drift. Without thinking, she rushed forward, sinking knee-deep in the snow. "Sir?" she called out, her voice lost in the wind. The man did not answer. She knelt beside him, turning him over carefully. His face was pale, his lips blue, and his coat was soaked with blood near the shoulder. Panic gripped her. He was still breathing, but barely. She could not leave him there. With great effort, she dragged him toward the cabin, one step at a time, her boots slipping on the ice. By the time she got him inside, she was out of breath and shaking. She laid him on the floor near the fire and tore off his wet coat. The wound was deep, a bullet wound, she realized, though she had never seen one up close. The thought made her stomach turn, but she pushed the fear aside. She fetched clean water, bandages, and the bottle of spirit Samuel used to keep for disinfecting cuts. As she cleaned the wound, the man stirred and let out a groan. His eyes fluttered open for a moment, dark and confused. "Where am I?" he whispered, his voice rough and weak. "You're safe," Clara said softly. "Don't move. You've lost a lot of blood." He tried to sit up, but she pressed a gentle hand on his chest. "Lie still," she said firmly. "You'll open the wound again." He blinked at her as if unsure whether she was real, then fell back into unconsciousness. Clara worked quickly, washing away the dried blood and wrapping his shoulder tightly. Her hands were steady, though her heart raced. When she was done, she sat back and studied his face. He was young, maybe in his early 30s, with a rough beard and a scar on his jaw. His clothes were travel-worn and dirty, his boots caked with mud. She didn't know who he was or how he had been shot, but one thing was certain. If he had enemies, they might come looking for him. And if the law was involved, she could be blamed for helping him. Still, she could not bring herself to throw him out. No one would survive the night in that storm. Hours passed. The wind battered the windows, but inside the cabin the man began to breathe easier. Clara sat nearby, changing his bandage and wiping the sweat from his forehead. In the flickering firelight, he looked less like a threat, and more like someone who had been running for too long. By morning, the storm had calmed. The world outside was buried in white silence. Clara fed the fire and made a pot of broth. When the man finally opened his eyes again, the smell of food filled the small room. He tried to speak, but she handed him a cup of warm broth and shook her head. "Don't talk yet," she said. "Just drink." He obeyed, his hands trembling as he lifted the cup. After a few slow sips, he managed a faint smile. "You saved my life," he said hoarsely. Clara nodded but said nothing. She studied him carefully. "What happened to you?" she asked after a pause. The man looked away. "Bad luck," he said after a long silence. "And a worse road." It was not the answer she wanted, but she did not push him. She could see he was tired and guarded. Still, something in his eyes, something honest and quiet, made her believe he was not a cruel man. The next few days passed slowly. Clara kept him inside, tending his wound and keeping the fire alive. He slept most of the time, his strength returning little by little. When he was awake, he thanked her with soft words and offered to help, though his body was too weak. Clara learned his name was Eli Turner. He said little about where he came from or who had hurt him, and each time she asked, his face grew distant. The days were long and quiet, but no longer empty. Clara found herself talking more than she had in months, telling small stories about the land, about her late husband, about the winters that came and went. Eli listened quietly, sometimes smiling, sometimes staring into the fire as if lost in thought. One evening, as snow fell gently outside, Clara asked him if he had anyone waiting for him somewhere. He looked up, his eyes shadowed by the firelight. "Not anymore," he said softly. There was a sadness in his voice that made her heart ache. She did not ask more. The storm finally broke for good after a week. The sun returned bright on the snow and the forest glittered like glass. Eli's strength returned enough for him to stand and walk around the cabin. He insisted on helping with chores, chopping wood, feeding the animals, mending the barn door that had been damaged in the storm. Clara tried to stop him, but he would not rest. Watching him work, she felt something shift inside her. It was strange to see another person move through the house again, to hear footsteps other than her own. For the first time in 2 years, she did not feel so alone. But even as peace settled over the cabin, a shadow lingered. Eli often stepped outside at night, looking out toward the hills as if expecting someone to appear. Once, when she caught him doing so, he said he was just listening to the wind. Yet Clara sensed it was more than that. He was hiding something, something that might one day find its way to her door. Still, she could not bring herself to send him away. Every morning when she saw him working in the snow, his breath forming clouds in the cold air, she felt a warmth she thought she'd forgotten. She told herself it was kindness, gratitude for his help, but deep down, she knew it was something gentler, something dangerous, and though she did not yet know it, the choice she made that stormy night to open her door and let a wounded stranger in was the moment that would change both their lives forever. The snow would soon begin to melt, and with it, the peace she had built around her lonely heart. The days after the storm passed slowly and the valley began to glow under the pale winter sun. The snow was still deep, but the air was no longer cruel. Smoke rose from Clara's chimney every morning, a small sign of life in the wide silence of the hills. Inside the cabin, things began to feel different. It was no longer just the sound of Clara's footsteps or the creak of the wooden floor. Now there was another voice, another pair of hands working quietly beside her. Eli Turner had recovered enough to move around on his own. His shoulder still hurt, but he refused to rest for long. He spent his mornings helping with the chores, insisting that he had to repay her kindness. Clara tried to tell him that he needed more time to heal, but he only smiled and said, "If I sit still too long, I'll start to rust." He repaired the broken latch on the barn door and stacked the woodpile higher than it had ever been. He carried water from the frozen creek, even though each trip left him breathless. Sometimes Clara would watch him from the window as he worked. There was something steady in the way he moved, something that made her feel both safe and uneasy. She knew little about him, yet she trusted him more than she expected. In the evenings, they shared simple meals by the fire. Clara cooked stew or cornbread, and Eli told small stories about the towns he had passed through. He never spoke about his family or his past, but he talked about places, the mountains in spring, the sound of a river after rain, the quiet of the desert at night. His words painted pictures, and Clara found herself listening closely, as if those faraway places could pull her out of her loneliness. Once, while Eli was fixing a loose board in the cabin wall, Clara asked him where he would go when the snow melted. He looked up from his work and said, "I don't know yet. Maybe somewhere the past can't find me." His answer was calm, but there was a sadness in it that lingered in the room. That night, Clara could not sleep. The fire had died down and the cabin was dark except for the faint moonlight through the window. She thought about the way Eli had spoken, like a man who had lost too much. She told herself it was not her concern, but a part of her heart whispered otherwise. As the days went on, the snow began to soften under the sun. The icicles on the roof dripped steadily, and patches of brown earth appeared along the trail that led to the valley road. Clara had not seen her neighbors in weeks, but one morning, she noticed a set of tracks in the snow near the fence line. Someone had passed by recently. Her stomach tightened. People rarely came up that far in winter unless they had a reason. Later that afternoon, she saw her nearest neighbor, old Mrs. Dunley, riding up on her horse. The woman looked curious the moment she stepped down. "Clara Hayes," she said, brushing the snow from her shawl. "I haven't seen a soul in weeks. Thought I'd check if you were still breathing in this cold." Clara smiled politely and invited her in. Eli had gone to the barn, so she hoped the visit would be quick. Mrs. Dunley talked about the usual things, broken fences, missing hens, and the stubborn cold, but her eyes roamed around the cabin. "You been keeping company, Clara?" she asked suddenly. Clara froze for a second. "No," she said softly. "Just me." Mrs. Dunley frowned. "Strange," she muttered. "Some folks down by the crossing say there's a man wandering these parts, wounded. Lawmen were asking about him a week ago. Dangerous sort, they say. Robbery or worse. You haven't seen anyone like that, have you?" Clara forced a small laugh. "If I had, I'd have sent him back down the road," she said. Mrs. Dunley gave her a long, knowing look. "You always were too kind for your own good," she said finally. "Be careful who you help. Not all men running from trouble are worth saving." When she left, Clara stood by the window, watching the woman disappear into the white hills. Her hands were shaking. She turned toward the barn, her heart heavy with worry. Eli was there, chopping wood. She walked to him and said quietly, "People are asking questions." He stopped mid-swing and looked at her. The air between them was still. "What kind of questions?" he asked. "About a man," she said. "A wounded man. They say he's wanted by the law." Eli set down the axe slowly. His face was calm, but his eyes grew distant. "And what did you tell them?" "That I hadn't seen anyone," she answered. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Eli said, "Thank you." He went back to splitting the log, but his movements were slower now, more careful. Clara watched him in silence, trying to make sense of the storm of thoughts inside her. That night, while Eli was sleeping, she decided to wash his coat. It was torn and stiff with dried blood. As she reached into the pocket, something crumpled inside caught her attention. She pulled it out and unfolded it under the lamplight. It was a piece of paper, a wanted poster. The drawing was rough, but she recognized the sharp lines of his jaw, the same scar near his temple. Below it, the words made her chest tighten. "Eli Turner, wanted for robbery and murder." The lamp nearly slipped from her hand. She stared at the poster, reading it again and again, hoping she was wrong. But the name was clear. The man sleeping in the next room, the one she had nursed back to life, was the very outlaw people were warning her about. Clara sat down, her mind spinning. She thought about the nights they had talked, the way he smiled when she laughed, the way he worked without complaint. None of it fit the picture of a killer. Yet the paper in her hand told a different story. She spent the rest of the night staring at the fire, trying to decide what to do. When morning came, she found Eli sitting by the table, his wound freshly bandaged. His eyes met hers, and she knew he had seen the poster. It was gone from where she had left it. "You found it," he said quietly. She didn't answer. Her voice trembled as she asked, "Is it true?" He sighed deeply. "Some of it is," he said, "but not the way they tell it." He told her that he had worked at a mining camp down south. The owner cheated the workers, keeping their wages for months. When Eli and a few others tried to take what was owed to them, things went wrong. A fight broke out. A gun went off. One man died, a deputy who had drawn first. Eli never meant for anyone to be killed, but once blood was spilled, there was no mercy. He ran, and the law branded him a murderer. Clara listened in silence. His words sounded honest, and his eyes did not waver. She wanted to believe him. The man she knew did not seem capable of cruelty. Still, fear crawled under her skin. If the law came here and found him, she would be seen as his accomplice. "You should go," she said at last, her voice low. "Before anyone else comes." Eli looked at her for a long moment. "If I leave now, they'll find me before I reach the next town. And if they find me here, they'll say you helped me. Either way, I bring trouble to your door." Clara turned away. "I can take care of myself." He stood slowly, wincing at the pain in his shoulder. "I don't want to cause you more harm," he said. "You've done enough for me." She looked back at him then, and something broke inside her. She remembered the night she had found him in the snow, the helpless man she had carried through the storm. Whatever he had done, she could not hate him for it. "You should rest," she said softly. "We'll talk about this tomorrow." But sleep did not come easily for either of them that night. Clara lay awake listening to the wind whisper outside. She wondered if kindness had made her foolish, or if, in helping a stranger, she had somehow helped herself too. And though she did not yet know it, the quiet bond growing between them would soon be tested by the truth that waited just beyond the melting snow. The snow began to melt as the days grew longer, and the sound of dripping water filled the air. Small streams formed along the edges of the yard, running down the hill where only weeks before everything had been frozen. The winter that had hidden them from the world was ending. Clara felt both relief and fear in equal measure. With spring would come travelers, traders, and people from the town below, and soon questions would follow. Eli's wound had healed enough that he could move freely again. He worked hard, repairing the fences, cleaning the barn, and helping Clara with whatever needed to be done. The rhythm of their days felt almost peaceful. Sometimes they shared laughter over small things, a stubborn chicken, a crooked nail, or a loaf of bread that burned at the edges. Those moments felt like sunlight after too many dark nights. Yet beneath that quiet peace, both of them carried secrets. Clara tried not to think about the wanted poster she had found. She had hidden it in the bottom drawer of her cabinet, but its image burned in her mind. Every time Eli went outside, she feared someone might see him and recognize his face. Every time a horse's distant sound echoed through the hills, she looked up with worry in her eyes. Eli knew she was troubled, though she tried to hide it. One afternoon, while fixing the fence, he said softly, "You don't have to be afraid of me, Clara." She looked up from the bucket she was carrying. "I'm not afraid," she said, though her voice wasn't steady. He gave her a faint smile. "You should be," he said gently. "Not because I'd ever harm you, but because trouble follows me, and I don't want it to reach your door." Clara set the bucket down and walked closer. "You didn't ask me to save you," she said. "I made that choice. I can live with it." Eli nodded, but she saw in his eyes that he didn't believe he deserved that kind of grace. He carried guilt the way other men carried tools, something always in hand, always ready to weigh him down. As the snow melted, the world around them began to move again. The road that had been buried all winter was now muddy but open. Smoke rose from the chimneys of distant homes. Birds returned, filling the air with their songs. Clara had almost begun to hope that maybe, just maybe, the world had forgotten about Eli Turner. But one morning, 2 riders appeared in the valley. Clara saw them from the kitchen window as they came down the hill, their horses leaving deep tracks in the wet ground. Her heart jumped. They wore long coats and carried rifles. Even from far away, she could see the badges glinting on their chests. Eli was outside near the barn. She ran to him, her voice trembling. "Lawmen," she whispered. 2 of them. "Coming this way." For a moment he said nothing. Then he looked toward the riders and took a slow breath. "It was only a matter of time," he said quietly. "What will you do?" She asked, panic rising in her chest. "I'll talk to them," he said. "Maybe I can end this without more running." "No," Clara said, grabbing his arm. "If they see you, they'll take you away, or worse. You're still weak." He looked at her hand on his arm, then back at her face. "I can't let them hurt you because of me." Clara didn't let go. "Then we'll hide you," she said firmly. "Go behind the barn, near the trees. I'll tell them I haven't seen anyone." For a long second, Eli hesitated. Then, seeing the determination in her eyes, he nodded and slipped away toward the woods. Moments later, the 2 riders reached the yard. The older one, tall with a gray beard, tipped his hat. "Ma'am," he said politely, "we're looking for a man. Name of Eli Turner. You seen anyone passing through?" Clara's pulse raced, but she kept her voice calm. "No one's been by here since the storm," she said. "It's been a quiet winter." The younger deputy narrowed his eyes. "You sure about that, ma'am? Folks down the road said a stranger was seen near this valley. Hurt his arm, maybe. That sound familiar?" Clara forced a small smile. "Lots of animals get hurt out here, deputy. But no strangers." The older man studied her face. "If you do see him, ma'am, be careful. He's wanted for robbery and killing a lawman. Some say he's dangerous." "I'll remember that," Clara said softly. They thanked her and rode on, but she watched them until they disappeared down the trail. Only when the sound of hooves faded completely did she let out the breath she'd been holding. Her hands were shaking when she went to the edge of the woods. "They're gone," she called softly. Eli stepped out from behind a tree, his face pale. "You shouldn't have lied for me," he said quietly. "I did what I had to," she said. "Now go inside before someone else sees you." That night, neither of them spoke much. The fear of discovery hung heavy in the air. Clara sat by the fire, sewing a torn sleeve, while Eli stared into the flames. After a long silence, he said, "I never meant to bring this to you. If I could change what happened that day, I would." Clara looked up. "Tell me what really happened, Eli. No half-truths this time." He took a deep breath, his eyes fixed on the fire. "We worked in a silver mine near Helena. The owner, a man named Corman, kept half our pay for himself. When the men protested, he sent his guards to beat us. My brother tried to stand up to them. They killed him. So I went back with a few men to take what we were owed. There was a fight. One of Corman's deputies drew his gun. I fired before I thought. He fell. They called it murder, but I never wanted blood." Clara listened, her eyes wet with tears. The pain in his voice was too real to be a lie. "What will you do now?" she asked quietly. "I'll go north," he said, "across the border. Start over, but I can't leave yet. The wound's not strong enough for that ride." She shook her head. "You won't make it far. The roads are still mud and they'll be watching every trail." Eli gave a sad smile. "Then I'll wait until the next thaw. But I won't stay if it puts you in danger." The next morning, Clara began packing small supplies: dried food, bandages, a map. She didn't tell him, but she was planning for both of them. If the law returned, she wouldn't let them take him. Somewhere deep inside, she knew she was already part of his story, and there was no going back. A few days later, the valley filled with new sounds, the river rushing faster, the crack of breaking ice and distant echoes of horses again. Clara's heart sank when she saw a group of riders at the far end of the trail. This time there were 4. They carried rifles and rode with purpose. "They're back," she whispered. Eli looked out the window, his jaw tightening. "Then it's time to go," he said. They gathered what little they could carry. Clara threw on her cloak and wrapped food in a cloth. Eli saddled the horse, though his shoulder ached with every movement. The plan was simple. Take the narrow trail through the woods to the old mill by the creek, then follow the stream north where no road led. Before they left, Clara looked around the cabin one last time. It had been her safe place, her home through grief and silence. Now it would be empty again. She whispered a small prayer under her breath and closed the door behind her. The sound of approaching horses grew louder. They moved quickly, cutting through the melting snow. Eli and Clara took the back path, their boots sinking in mud. Every few minutes, Eli looked back to make sure they weren't followed. His breath came hard, and the pain in his shoulder made him stumble more than once. Clara helped him steady himself, refusing to let him fall. When they reached the ridge, they could see the valley below, and the lawmen searching the cabin. Smoke rose from the chimney as one of them kicked the door open. Clara held her breath. "They'll burn it," Eli said quietly. "Then we keep moving," she said, her voice firm. And so they did. They walked until the sun began to set, leaving behind the only life Clara had ever known. Ahead of them lay miles of wild land, cold rivers, thick forests, and the uncertain promise of safety. But in that moment, as they stood side by side at the edge of the fading snow, Clara felt something she hadn't felt in years. Not fear, not sadness, but a fragile kind of hope. The world was thawing, and so was her heart. But she knew spring would not bring peace easily. For love and for truth, both of them would have to face what waited beyond the melting hills. The days after their escape were tense and silent. Clara and Eli moved cautiously through the thawing landscape, following trails hidden among the trees and along the rushing streams. The snow had melted enough to reveal the muddy ground, but it was still slippery and difficult to navigate. Every sound, a snapping branch, a distant bird call, or the faint rush of water, made Clara's heart race. She kept close to Eli, helping him when the uneven ground made his shoulder ache. They found a small cave near the side of the creek, where they could rest during the day. Eli wrapped his shoulder tightly with bandages Clara had packed, while she boiled water for their meager meal. The air was damp and cold, but it was safer than being out in the open. They ate in silence, both listening to the sounds of the forest and the distant valley below. Each day they traveled only a few miles, careful not to leave tracks that could lead pursuers to them. Eli's strength was returning slowly, but the journey was difficult. Clara could see how hard it was for him to ride the horse for long periods. At times she had to hold him upright and steady him when he faltered. Despite this, Eli never complained. Instead, he encouraged her, saying, "Keep moving. One step at a time, Clara. That's all we can do." Even with the danger looming, moments of quiet together allowed them to talk, laugh, and share stories. Eli told Clara about the small town he grew up in, the fields he had played in as a boy, and the river where he had learned to swim. Clara, in turn, spoke of her husband Samuel, the life they had shared, and the lessons she had learned from surviving on her own. These conversations became their way of keeping hope alive, a reminder that life had not ended even in the shadow of fear. However, the peaceful moments were short-lived. One afternoon, as they made their way along a narrow path near a bend in the creek, Clara heard the sound of hooves in the distance. She froze, pressing herself close to Eli. The horses were fast, and the riders were shouting. Clara's stomach dropped as she realized they had been found. Eli looked at her grimly. "We have to run," he said. They pushed their horse faster, following a hidden trail that led through thick woods. The riders behind them were persistent, shouting and firing shots that splintered the trees around them. Eli guided Clara and the horse through a narrow ravine, where the high walls of rock provided some cover. Bullets whizzed past them, and the sharp crack of rifles echoed through the valley. Clara clung to Eli, her knuckles white against his arm. Suddenly, the horse stumbled in the mud, throwing them both forward. Clara rolled to her feet and pulled Eli up, checking his shoulder. He had taken a graze from a bullet that nicked his arm, but he pushed forward, refusing to stop. "Keep moving," he shouted, voice strained with pain. They ran until they reached a frozen creek bed, the ice making a slippery path but also providing a narrow escape route. The pursuing men slowed at the creek, uncertain about crossing the ice. Eli took Clara's hand, leading her carefully across the frozen water. The ice creaked beneath their weight, but they managed to reach the far bank safely. Once on solid ground, they collapsed behind a thicket, breathing heavily. Clara's heart pounded in her chest, and Eli winced as he adjusted his shoulder. "Are you hurt?" she asked, worry in her voice. "Just a scratch," he said, trying to smile. "We're lucky this time." They stayed hidden until nightfall, then continued moving quietly under the cover of darkness. The forest seemed endless, and each step brought them further from the valley and the cabin they had once called home. They slept in small clearings, taking turns keeping watch. Clara often found herself staring at Eli, noticing the quiet determination in his eyes and the way he never let fear control him. By the 5th day, they reached an abandoned cabin deep in the woods. It was small and weathered, but it offered shelter and a chance to rest properly. Eli repaired the roof slightly, and Clara cleaned the floor as best she could. For the first time in days, they ate a warm meal together without fear of interruption. Yet even here, danger was not far away. The lawmen were still searching, and Clara knew that staying too long would put them at risk. She worried for Eli, for herself, and for the fragile life they were trying to build together. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Eli took her hands in his. "We can't keep running forever," he said softly. "At some point, I have to face what I've done. I can't ask you to keep hiding with me forever." Clara shook her head. "I'm not leaving you," she said firmly. "We'll face it together." Eli looked at her, a mixture of gratitude and sorrow in his eyes. "I don't deserve you," he whispered. "You're wrong," Clara replied. "You saved my life once. Now I'm saving yours." Days passed, and the forest slowly came alive with spring. Birds returned. Flowers began to bloom along the creek, and the sun warmed their faces. Yet the memory of the pursuit remained, a shadow over every step. Clara and Eli continued their cautious journey north, moving only at night and hiding during the day. They relied on each other completely, their bond growing stronger with every shared hardship. Finally, after several weeks, they reached a remote ranch where they found refuge. The owner, a kind but cautious man, allowed them to work in exchange for food and shelter. For the first time in months, Clara and Eli could rest without fear of immediate pursuit. They tended animals, repaired fences, and worked the land quietly. Life became a rhythm again, though the shadow of the past lingered in the back of their minds. Despite the relative safety, they both knew that the law would not forget Eli's name. One day it might catch up to them. Still, they had survived fire, snow, and bullets together. They had faced danger and come through it stronger. Their shared experiences forged a connection that was deeper than fear or gratitude. One night, as they sat together under the stars, Clara whispered, "I wonder if we'll ever be free of it all." Eli looked at her, his eyes reflecting the starlight. Freedom isn't just a place, he said. It's knowing that whatever comes, we face it together. Clara smiled, feeling the warmth of hope for the first time in months. The journey had been long and perilous, but it had also shown them both what mattered most: courage, trust, and the quiet strength of standing together in the face of danger. And as the snow melted and the forest grew green again, they realized that the hardest battles were not behind them, but that together they could face whatever lay ahead. The valley was behind them. The lawmen were still searching, but love, determination, and the will to survive carried them forward into an uncertain, yet promising future. The green of spring had fully returned to the valley, though Clara and Eli were far from it now. They had found a small remote cabin north of the rivers and hills, hidden from the main trails where they could live quietly under assumed names. The past months had been harsh and exhausting, yet they had survived together, each relying on the other in ways neither had expected. Every morning the sun rose over the forest, casting golden light across the trees, and with it came a sense of cautious hope. Eli was stronger now. His shoulder had healed completely, and he moved with a careful but confident grace. Clara often watched him work, the way he chopped wood, fed the animals, and repaired the small cabin. It was different from before. They were not just surviving. They were building a life, fragile but real. She had learned to trust him fully, and he had learned to trust her not just with his safety but with his heart. Their days were simple, yet they were filled with small joys. Clara would bake bread in the morning, and Eli would fetch water from the creek, always careful to avoid muddy paths that might slow them down. They tended to the garden together, planting vegetables and flowers that would grow through the summer. Sometimes they would sit on the small porch looking out over the forest, listening to the birds sing and sharing stories about the world they had left behind. Even with this peace, a shadow lingered. Both of them knew that Eli could not hide forever. The lawmen who had chased him through the valley were still searching, and the danger could return at any moment. Clara tried not to dwell on it, but at night, she would often lie awake, listening to the wind through the trees, imagining the sound of horses' hooves, and worrying. Eli understood her fears. One evening, as they sat by the fire, he reached for her hand. "I can't ask you to live like this forever," he said softly. "One day they will come, and I can't let them take you with me into that danger." Clara shook her head. "I'm not leaving you," she said firmly. "We face this together, remember?" He looked at her, eyes filled with gratitude and sorrow. "You've given me more than I deserve," he said. "You saved my life once, and now you've given me a reason to keep living." The days passed slowly but steadily. They continued to work at the cabin, fixing what needed repairing, planting more vegetables, and gathering firewood for the coming winter. They also spent long hours talking about the future, dreaming quietly of a life where the past would not chase them, a life where they could be free from fear. Months went by, and the seasons began to change again. One day, while Clara was gathering water from the creek, a distant rider appeared on the horizon. Her heart leapt, and for a moment fear gripped her. But as the rider approached, she saw the familiar face of a local messenger who had come from the town beyond the hills. He carried a letter, delivered with care and urgency. Clara took the letter with trembling hands and opened it. Eli read over her shoulder, and their eyes met as he recognized the words. The letter was from the local authorities, announcing that the investigation into the events at the Valley cabin had concluded. Evidence had come to light about the mine owner, Corman, and his greed and cruelty. Witnesses had confirmed that Eli had acted in self-defense and had tried to protect others. The authorities offered a reduced sentence for his actions and promised that he would not be pursued further if he surrendered voluntarily. Eli's hands shook as he folded the letter. "It's real," he said quietly. "They're giving me a chance." Clara reached for him, holding his hands in hers. "Then go," she said softly. "You've earned it. You don't have to run anymore." He shook his head. "Not without you," he said. "I couldn't face that world alone. Not after everything we've been through." Together they made a plan. They would travel to the town where Eli would surrender, but Clara would stand by him. They would tell the truth about the robbery, the fight at the mine, and about how he had only ever acted in self-defense. They knew the testimony of witnesses combined with Clara's own words could finally clear his name. The journey to town was careful but steady. They moved during daylight when the roads were less traveled and took hidden trails whenever they could. Along the way, they encountered the first signs of spring's full life: blooming flowers, fresh green grass, and the soft sound of birdsong. It was a stark contrast to the harsh, snow-covered valley they had fled months before. Each step forward strengthened their hope, even as the memories of danger lingered in the back of their minds. When they arrived, the process was slow and tense. Eli surrendered peacefully, and Clara stayed by his side, supporting him through every question and every look from the officials. They told the truth, fully and clearly, and gradually, the story of greed, injustice, and self-defense emerged. The evidence against him was weighed. The witnesses spoke, and for the first time, Eli felt the burden on his chest lighten. Weeks later, Eli received word that his sentence had been reduced further, and he would be released early. The relief that came over him was almost too much to bear. He and Clara walked together out of the town's courthouse, free in every sense that mattered. Back at their cabin, they rebuilt what had been damaged in the winter and the chase. They repaired the roof, mended fences, and planted more vegetables in the garden. The forest around them seemed to breathe with life, and the sun warmed their faces in a way it hadn't for months. Clara felt a deep sense of peace, the valley and the danger behind them, and a future stretching ahead filled with hope and hard-earned freedom. Eli often looked at her with quiet gratitude. "I wouldn't be here without you," he said one evening as they sat together on the porch watching the stars appear in the clear night sky. Clara smiled, leaning into him. "And I wouldn't be the same without you," she replied. "We saved each other, Eli, that's all that matters." The years that followed were not without challenge. They built a home from the ground up, worked the land, and grew stronger together through the seasons. But the memories of winter, of the chase, and of the fire that had taken their old life remained. They did not haunt them, but served as reminders of how far they had come. By the time Eli was fully free, they had created a quiet, happy life. The forest and hills around them were no longer dangerous, but comforting. The cabin was warm, the garden flourished, and their bond had become unbreakable. Clara and Eli had faced loss, fear, and the relentless pursuit of the law, yet in the end, love and trust had guided them through. One evening, as the sun set over the forest and painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Clara and Eli stood hand in hand on the porch, looking at the world they had fought so hard to claim. The snow had long melted, replaced by green fields and blossoming flowers. They had survived together, and together they had found freedom, peace, and a love that had endured the harshest tests. No matter what came next, they knew they could face it. For they had discovered the truth that mattered most: that courage, compassion, and love could endure even the darkest storms, and that life, when shared with someone you trust, could be brighter than the coldest winter or the sharpest danger. And so, with the sun setting behind the hills and the forest alive with the sounds of spring, Clara and Eli stepped forward into their future, together, free and full of hope.